As guitar players, most of us understand that there are complementary pairings as it relates to specific types of guitars and pickups versus certain types of pedals. So the objective today is to look at pedals that ordinarily are thought to be best used with single coil pickups, but pair them today with humbucking style guitars. So let's talk about the pedals today that are in question. The first today is the Fuzz Face. Now, many of us famously know this pedal from Jimi Hendrix, and I would argue that he's probably the most famous player that's ever used this product. Now, of course, there's been other players that have used it famously, but for the most part, this is thought of as a single coil pairing. When I think of Fuzz Face users outside of Jimi Hendrix, I think of guys like Eric Johnson. And I think the only exception where I really see guys using Fuzz Faces that are primarily humbucker users are Joe Bonamassa. But I did notice in researching the Joe Bonamassa fuzz that they did spend a lot of time to make it more complementary with the types of guitars that he was using that have a lot more output than an ordinary single coil pickup. So there are exceptions to this, but I still think we generally associate the Fuzz Face as a single coil pickup pairing as far as the guitar being used, and that primarily being a Stratocaster, again, heavily influenced by Jimi Hendrix. We're going to try it today with humbuckers and see how it sounds. So I'm going to be using my Gibson Les Paul. This is a 58 reissue, standard burst bucker pickups. Everything about the guitar is stock. I'm going to be using the clean channel of a replica Dumble Overdrive Special, with which I've built using all vintage Fender parts and transformers. You're going to hear it clean. You're going to hear it dirty with the pedal engaged, and then you're going to hear the track overlaid, and then I'm going to just maybe do a little solo take so you can hear how it actually sounds in the context of those particular tracks. And I think it'll give us a better sense of how good these can sound in real music being accompanied by actual backing tracks, so we get a sense of how they sound in the mix and why you might want to incorporate some of these style pedals, if not these exact pedals, into your particular rig if you're more of a humbucker player, or if you mostly play single coils and you're concerned about how some of your pedals might translate to a humbucking style guitar. So let's start first with the Fuzz Face. So I think we can all agree. It sounds, fuzzy. Now, I in the first kind of part of the solo, I had the volume knob down just slightly, and I brought it up just a tick when I kind of went into the second half of the solo, because I felt like it was a little too maybe overdrivey, and it wasn't fuzzy enough, and so I kind of kicked in the fuzz a little bit more. And that's the thing about volume pots, is they can be so dynamic with Fuzz Faces. If you just go back a tick or two on your volume control, you can really get a large degree of variety out of these types of pedals, and it helps kind of take them back from the edge a little bit if you don't want it to be so over the top. So the next pedal I want to move to is the Ibanez Tube Screamer. Now in my hands, I have a TS10. This is slightly different than the TS9 or TS808, but they're all in the Tube Screamer family, and they're roughly the same sounding guitar pedals. Now for this, I'm going to do the exact same process. I'm going to go to the humbucking pickup in my Tom Anderson Super Strat here, and this is a Seymour Duncan 78 distortion. It's supposed to sound kind of like that EVH style humbucking pickup that he might have used in his Super Strats. And, I'm going to set this, pretty much with the knobs roughly straight up at noon, maybe a little bit more overdrive just to get me a little bit, further into the overdrive and distortion category to give me that extra sustain that I might want. I think in particular, this sounds really good with humbuckers in a kind of bolt-on neck style, even though this does have two single coils. We're not going to be using those. And certainly guys like Steve Lukather and many other kind of shredder guys and kind of virtuoso rock players from the 80s did use Tube Screamers with high gain amps and kind of Super Strats and humbuckers, or even Les Pauls and things like that, to kind of tighten up the low end. And they can be really great for that. But I do think that these certainly are overwhelmingly paired with single coils, but we're going to show today that it really does sound great with humbuckers as well. So let's have a listen and see how it sounds. if you didn't recognize that track, it was actually a little bit of a Toto backing track that I was using, and I was just trying to channel my best Steve Lukather, poorly as it was. But I think we can say confidently that these really sound great, especially with this kind of EVH style pickup and this kind of super strat from Tom Anderson. Really amazing pedal. Love how the Tube Screamer sounds. All right, so next up is the Nile compressor. Generally, as far as humbucking pickups and pedals are concerned, you very rarely see compressors used with any regularity. You don't necessarily have to have a Nile compressor, although I do love the Nile. It's got a compression channel, and then it's got a preamp channel that's just kind of emulating kind of the preamp or mic pre's that you might find in some of the best recording studios across the land. And you can combine them or use them independently. And I'm really using it here to crank up that preamp sound, add a little bit more saturation, and then get that beautiful sustain from the studio compression side. And I'm going to be using an Eric Clapton track from a band that he was in very briefly in the 90s called TDF. And a lot of people aren't aware of it. And it was almost like a electronic, like dance hall record, which is very rare. You should definitely check out this album if you haven't. There's some great Clapton guitar playing on there, very unique Eric Clapton guitar playing on it. I'm going to use a little section of a track from that, and I'm going to be using it to really exaggerate the sustain of this DGT model from PRS. Again, everything about this guitar is stock. It's a standard DGT. I think it's about 10 or 15 years old, and we're just going to be using the compression and the preamp to just add a little bit more bloom to the note, allow that sustain, and just kind of outline the things that are already going on in that track. And again, you're going to get to hear the guitar clean first into the amp, then I'll bring in the pedal, and then you're going to get to hear the pedal in the context of the track. So you hear how it sounds in a mix. So Nile, I think it sounded great for this. It didn't get too overdriven. It was still fairly mild and just had a lot of sustain. And I think a good example of what you can do with kind of cleaner humbucker sounds to just get that sustain to kind of help throw you over the edge. So you kind of get the sustain and bloom of a more overdriven style sound, but you get to have it in a kind of a cleaner setting like we did here. I think it really sounded great in this context. And most certainly, you can dial a compressor to be tastefully used with a humbucker. And of course, it helps if you have an extra channel to kind of help dial in that EQ and the output and kind of the amount of grit that you want and saturation. And this is really great for that because you have that compressor separately from the preamp that you can kind of mix together. So next up, I have the Marshall Blues Breaker. Now, this is the sort of the baseline with which many derivative overdrives have come, whether you're talking about Analog Man's King of Tone and then all the shoot-offs of that, the Morning Glory from JHS. This is a highly, highly replicated pedal and absolutely sounds great. But again, when we think of most of the classic users of this pedal, a lot of them are single coil players. When we're thinking about even the offshoots, whether that be John Mayer, whether that be Kenny Wayne Shepherd, this is generally thought of as being a single coil style overdrive pairing. Now, we're going to do the same exact thing that we did before. I'm going to be pairing it with my Gibson ES335. This is a 1968 original ES335. Everything is stock. Pickups are stock. Saddles are stock. I think the only thing that actually isn't stock is the bridge was replaced because at one point this had a Bigsby. So the ABR1, I think, was replaced, at least the stop tailpiece was. But everything else about it is absolutely stock. We're going to be hearing that with this. And I'm going to be using a track that you might recognize. It's Sean Colvin's song from the 90s called Sonny Came Home. It has some really tasty guitar work on it. I'm going to be trying to emulate some of the tastiness there to the degree that is possible with my limitations. And this is a really great pedal for that kind of like low gain overdrive, just like kind of a little bit vibey. And it really is great for those kind of, I don't know, Americana are kind of like lower gain rock sounds, and I'm going to try to bring the best I can out of this for that particular tune. And again, you're going to hear it first with just the clean sound of the guitar into the amp. Then I'll engage the pedal, you get to hear what it sounds like dirty, and then we'll bring in the track so you can hear how it sounds in the context of a mix. Let's have a listen. So I think this absolutely sounded great. It sounded so creamy with the 335. I really loved what it was doing. It had a beautiful sustain, just kind of like a bloom to it. And, you know, I do know that there's guys that use the King of Tone, which again is a derivative of this with humbuckers. I think Tom Bukovac is a good example of that. But I still think these are primarily identified as kind of being more for single coil players, more of that kind of bluesier stuff. Again, Kenny Wayne Shepherd being a guy who's been a longtime evangelist of the King of Tone. But I think nonetheless, these sound amazing with humbuckers, and certainly there's no reason not to use a bluesbreaker style pedal, whether it be King of Tone, Prince of Tone, Duke of Tone, JHS Morning Glory. There's so many great bluesbreaker choices out there. They absolutely sound amazing, whether they're paired with humbuckers or single coils. I love this pedal with this 335. So last but not least, we're going to use the Klon Centaur to see how it sounds in a similar context. We're going to be using my PRS 513. I have it set in kind of the PAF style setting, which is kind of the middle setting here. And then I'm going to be using the bridge pickup, totally stock guitar, no changes here. And then we're going to be using it into the Klon. And we're going to be doing a little track here that is from Rustin Kelly, a song called Mockingbird. There's a little kind of intro section. I'm just going to be kind of taking an Americana country-ish solo using the PRS, using the Klon Centaur. And so we can really see how it sounds in that context. I think it'll actually sound really great. There is some precedent of guys using these with humbuckers like Warren Haynes, even though this is still primarily known to be a single coil pairing. Again, guys like Jeff Beck, John Mayer really famously using this with their Strats. Now you're going to hear it the same way again, just the guitar into the amp clean. Then I'm going to bring in the pedal. You're going to get to hear the pedal into the amp, again, no track. And then we're going to bring in the track and you're going to get to hear how it sounds in a mix. So I think it sounded really great. You know, again, my limited, kind of facility as a guitar player, I think that we can hear that this really does sound great. It stands out. The mid-range pokes through really well. I kind of dialed up the treble a little bit more because sometimes it can sound a little honky. And I did use the gain slightly lower than this. I'm sorry, I'm kind of bumping my settings here as I'm taking it off from the floor. But I kind of, try to use it as almost like a lower gain boost almost. And it really sounded beautiful for that with the Les Paul. So maybe a tip for those of you who want to use a Centaur with humbuckers, I recommend kind of using a little bit more treble content and kind of backing off the gain so that you don't get it so honky and so mid-rangey. That kind of helps control it a little bit better so you get a little bit better response and interaction between the guitar and amplifier. Really sounds great. Absolute winner here. I can't see why you wouldn't want to use it in single coils or with your humbucking style guitars. So those were 5 pedals that we ordinarily associate with being kind of classic pairings with single coils, but as we saw today, can really work great with different styles of humbuckers. Of course, many of you may know this already. There are infinite ways to use and combine pedals, but I think so often as guitar players, we get stuck in a box where we see the way that something's used, we just stick to that use case. And I think that we can have a little bit more freedom by getting to explore some of these amazing pedals and using them in maybe contexts that they weren't always seen to be used in, or that we never thought to use them in. And certainly these pedals sounded amazing no matter what we threw at them. If you're interested in any of these pedals, we're going to have them all linked in the description. Of course, for some of the more rare ones like the Klons or the vintage Blues Breakers, they're not going to be those available unless you go to the used market. So we're going to list some alternatives that I really like, whether that be the J Rocket Archer, and they have several different versions of that, including a Jeff Beck style one, who's another great player of the Klon. And for the Fuzz Faces, there's plenty of reissues. And for the Blues Breakers, again, there's several different companies that make replicas of a Blues Breaker in different formats. And for the TS9s, TS808s, there's still versions of that are made today. So we'll have those all listed in the description below. And if you like what you saw today, I highly recommend that you like, you subscribe, you leave us a comment of other pedals that we maybe classically think are paired with either a humbucker only or a single coil only. And maybe we'll do the reverse. Maybe we'll do guitar pedals that are generally thought to be only good with humbuckers, and then we'll shoot them out with a bunch of single coil guitars. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you want to support us further, there's several ways you can do that. Check out our free podcast, Chairman of the Boards, over on Apple or Spotify or anywhere that you get your podcasts. And if you want to check out any of the cables like we used today to connect everything, those are all available from our friends over at Sweetwater or direct from us over on the rigdr.com. You can get custom-made patch cables to the exact length that you want, in addition to instrument cables using our recommended cables for input and output. And until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka the Rig Doctor. And these were 5 pedals that don't necessarily get thought of as being used with humbuckers, but really do sound great with them. See you next time.